So there we go. Okay, question 4. And it says, if my voice holds out long enough, I've been talking a lot today. So question 4, it says, hello, Dr. Luke. I am wondering if you could please provide some tips on what to prepare for an interview for an instructional design role in a university. I got a job interview next week, and I am looking for your insight. Thank you very much. I would highly appreciate your reply. So I did already actually reply to this person because it was a timely question.
Right.
So
I was concerned about that.
The answer was delivered to this person. I will now follow up, though, obviously, with more details and information. Did you want me to tackle this? Is it my turn? Is it your turn?
It's mine, but I do want you to tackle it since you've kind of already touched on it.
No, it's your turn.
No,
we're not. No. We're not going out of turn here, Indy. It's not how we do things. It's your turn.
It's not how we're doing this today. Okay, so I always warn people before I start talking about interviews. My master's degree is in communication studies, and I taught speech. So I always bring that experience into talking about interviews. But I follow a pattern when I have interviews, no matter what it's for. Sometimes I do interviews for practice, which I do advise that people do. Just find something that you're interested in, get an interview, even if it's informal, and just practice that skill because you never know if you need it. But I suggest you find your favorite instructional design model or theory and be able to justify why it is your favorite. That's where I would start. And the reason being is because it is amazing how difficult it is to explain an instructional design model years later after you've studied it. Like, for example, I actually tried it. I did this experiment. I named 3. So my favorite is Addy, and then Kirkpatrick, and then Gagne. Those are my 3. I love them. A lot of people love other ones. But if someone asks me, why do I like Addy as opposed to something else? I would have to say because I love the element of freedom that Addy gives me to use my creativity in the instructional design process. And I could justify that with the different steps of analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And I could walk through each step. It covers all of the steps of the instructional design process, and I could speak to all of them. That's where I would start. And it doesn't have to take a lot of time, but it really does challenge you to be able to vocalize why you like instructional design and why you're good at it. And explaining that shows and demonstrates to whoever you're interviewing with that you can explain instructional concepts to anyone. So it's kind of like you have all of these wonderful assets that you put in this basket by just studying one theory and being able to explain it. So that's where I always start. I also have kind of like an approach to an interview question. So, Luke, if you were asking me an interview question, I would listen carefully, possibly take notes if I felt that I needed to. Jot down a couple of points that I wanted to say. So after I hear the question, I pause. Get used to the silence, because the way an interview is designed is it is designed so that you talk too much. You are supposed to talk too much so that they can find out more about you than you want to reveal. The way you control that, especially with a person like myself, and I love to talk, is I control my answers by controlling my silence. So I listen to the question, take a couple of notes, take a deep breath, then I answer the question, and I stop talking. So you make sure that you answer the question that was asked and stop talking. And normally they're waiting for more and they'll ask a second question. That's when you know you can continue talking. That's just how I approach it. And then after that, I try to make sure those answers are very concise and very clear, and I endure the silence because I have to go into this process knowing that I am comfortable with who I am. I'm comfortable with my capabilities and my skills. And in this room, I'm going to show you why I am the best candidate for this job. So those are just from a communication perspective for some of the things I do, and from an instructional design perspective, some of the things I do to prepare for the interview. And so see if that works.
I love it. I love it. And I actually answered this question a little bit differently too. So
Okay.
they're getting a full perspective about everything, which is awesome. So the way that I think about instructional design interviews comes down into three different types of classifications of questions, if you want to be able to say it that way. So I do already have like an entire video on YouTube about like preparing for instructional design interviews, which I'll put in the show notes somewhere. But this is more about just giving you like a general overview. With the first one is talking about more about you as the individual, because that question will always come up of like, why are you looking to transition? How do you work best with doing blah, blah, blah? What are your superpowers? Like, it's more about you as the individual person, kind of about like, why are you here? Why do you want to be a part of this kind of thing? Which are, it always is like coming up for conversational piece for that one. Then from there, thinking more about the actual learning nerd side. So what you were talking about with Addie and Gagne and everything like that, where of course for me, I'm using backward design.
Right.
I've dabbled in agile. I've done, whatever. But I definitely want to know more. If I was interviewing this person for an instructional design position, I definitely want to hear more about their learning strategies and learning techniques too, because that's one thing that I've noticed from how I've actually designed a bunch of my projects and courses and programs is that I use certain types of learning strategies and techniques more than others. So I do use project-based learning more. I do use simulations. I do use scenario-based learning. Like, I go into that style, and if you say any of those magical words of like, oh yeah, I've done a whole bunch with universal design for learning, I can definitely take the course and flip it into whatever. It's just like, wonderful. I'm glad we can start talking shop, and I don't have to try to like gauge that level of like, where are we kind of thing. Also, based around learning, then we're going to be talking more about SMEs, just huge subject matter experts. I need to know how you work with other people, especially if you are going to be like the face of the institution working with a SME. That is so crucial. And of course, learning more about like your projects and the lessons that you took away from them, your evaluation process. Really curious about that type of a wrap-up reflection inside of there. And then the third classification is in talking more about basically being on a team. So talking about decisions, group-based decisions, collaboration. How do you handle conflict? How do you manage that? What type of atmosphere do you like to work in? What type of pace do you work in as? Like, those are the things I want to know more about. So it's individual, it's going to be learning nerd stuff, and then it's going to be team stuff. That's kind of the three things. So that's usually, I've noticed too, that when I wrote down a sample of all these typical interview questions that I will ask if we're hiring somebody. And I noticed now it's just like, they all fit into one bucket. Some way, shape, or form, all those questions kind of fit in about, walk me through a key decision on one of your projects. What was the cause and effect of that decision? How do you evaluate your work? If you can go back and revise one past project, what would you do and why? How do you make your courses engaging? Walk me through the design process, share with me details about how you designed a course, a program, or a training. What are you most proud of? A whole bunch of just questions I just threw at you that could 100% hypothetically be on an instructional design interview or a panel or a group or however it is, individual or panel style. But that is kind of how I would prepare, would be to think about those questions ahead of time. Write them down, as you mentioned, Indy. Practice, communicate effectively. I would, if depending upon how serious you are too, I would go above and beyond and actually record how you give the answers, like on Zoom, just to see about how you actually respond with your body language and eye contact. And then if you, like, are you doing like what I'm doing right now, where like I'm moving my hands every 3 seconds? It's very distracting. Shouldn't be doing that on a YouTube video, but that is unfortunately how I talk. So it's something I would need to work on from that stance. But those types of things you can then make notes about. You can practice again. You can try to see if you can improve it the next time again and again and again, until eventually you're like, all right, I got it. Like, this is the very best I can do. Let me give this a shot.
Exactly. And I also, it's really kind of funny. I think about everything you listed, but I am so focused on having that conversation, because instructional design interviews that I've been in, they want to know how I talk to people.
Right.
They want to know how I communicate. And so everything you listed is perfect. And I've done it at some level, but it's so funny. But when people talk to me about interviews, 9 times out of 10, they are concerned about how they communicate. And it's just interesting to hear how you look at the details and how I was completely focused. I usually focus on the conversation because I've noticed when you relax, all that stuff, all that studying you suggested people do and writing things down and learning, it comes out. But if you're nervous and you're, anxious or, like you said, moving your hands, which I do as well, you are not going to come out. And really the truth of the matter is they're hiring you. And no matter what job you go into, you are going to have to learn that organization. So I believe in taking both of these approaches. I would literally do both of them because
100%.
Definitely writing down everything, but also find that moment in which you know that you are good enough for this and have that conversation, because what you know won't do you any good if you can't get it out. That's true. The speech teacher and me talking.
Hey, love it. Love it. And then the other thing which is important that I just want to make sure that I didn't forget as well too is the fact that, remember, you were also interviewing them. Like,
that is so true.
They don't hold all the power. Like, yes, you obviously want to get a job that you're going to care about and blah, blah, blah. Totally. But at the same time too, you need to know, is it a right fit for you? It's not just about them saying like, are you a right fit for it? No. Like, are you good for me? Like, are we going to work well together, or is this actually like, no, I think I'm good. We should kind of like part ways, because that is a completely appropriate response where let's hypothetically speaking, let's say you make it into the second round, you give it some thought and you're like, you know what? Thank you so much for the opportunity, but actually I think I'm going to pass. I have another thing, but I think I'm going to be more aligned for, but would really appreciate staying connected in the future. That's completely okay to do.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Which is if you get to that level, of course, that is a wonderful thing by all means, because I know that many people right now are unfortunately just applying for anything. Yes. Like they're shooting for anything. And it's just like, you really need to be more precise. I get it. I understand why you're applying for everything. But once you figure out exactly what you love, it's going to come across in that interview too, talking about what you were just saying with communication.
Yes.
If you're applying for a job and you're interviewing for something that you just don't want and you're like, oh, a job's a job, I'm here. Like, it's going to come across that way. Like, much like the other question talking about the training. If you're not passionate about the training topic, they're going to know. The interviewers will know.
It's obvious because, I love instructional design. But I also love working with people and instructional design. It's kind of like my candy and my cake. That's the way I look at it. But as you were talking about, you were interviewing them, I always stress, and I almost forgot until you mentioned that, always have a question to ask them.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Walk in there, listen for a minute, and formulate a question. So when they ask that question, and they should always ask, do you have any questions for us? Do not let that interview end until you ask that question, because that question says more about you than you realize. It shows, so I was listening, there's some concerns that I have, or I just want to know something else. And I usually come up with two. And one of them is, I just want to know a little bit more about X. And the second one is, I just want a clarification about the actual job. How people view those, I've had mixed results about how people see, listen to both of those questions, but I've never had anyone not answer them. Ask the question. Ask at least one question. And that actually will that'll make it memorable, because we always remember the first thing someone tells us and the last thing someone tells us. And if the last thing you told them was that question, and it's a good one. So use that opportunity.
The one question that I like to hear, because I want people to ask because they're curious about knowing, which is a good thing, is that they want to know if this is a new position because the organization is growing, or if you're backfilling. Wow. And you're like, that's a good question. You want to know that. Are we in there? Are we going in the right direction, or did we have something bad and we're trying to fix the problem? It's a good question to ask right from the get-go. One question that I asked, and I did not take the position where I was just like, this is not going to go well, was that I asked about how much of the influence in the decision-making process does the instructional design team have at the institution? Yeah, because talking with them, I was getting that vibe, or was this like, I feel like you potentially have no power and that you're kind of getting like walked over kind of thing. So I was just, it got to my point of like my turn to ask the questions, and I asked that. And I knew instantly, and I think I mentioned this on a long time podcast episode ago, but when I asked that question, one of the people like actually like snorted. Like she laughed. Like she laughed so hard, being like, she couldn't hide it. And I was like, there's my sign. Well, thank you very much. I'm good. I'm not ready for this. So
that is the wrong. Oh, and that I'm glad you brought that up, because if you get any vibes in an interview, go the opposite direction. There is always another job for you, because there is nothing worse than being a bad fit with them or them being a bad fit in your life. And I'm glad that you talked about a realistic situation in which you had a choice, because there are some, I have been on interviews in which I knew from the first few minutes, that's okay. And a lot of people are like, no, you shouldn't. It's okay. Follow your gut. Follow that gut instinct. And that's why listening to the questions they ask you and looking at their responses to your questions. By the way, people are like, oh, well, you're interviewing and they never show responses. Yes, they do. Listen to responses. Look at body language. I had an interview with someone one time, and she turned her body away from me and asked the questions and didn't look at me. There were 4 people in the room, and she literally turned to the side. It was pretty clear she did not want that. Nope. That wasn't a good fit.
Nope.
For whatever reason. So those are just so important. Yes, know your instructional design. Yes, be able to answer all of the questions that Luke outlined. They're excellent questions. They're very important. Yes, be able to articulate instructional design theories, because as you're going over those theories, you'll realize how much you are answering those other questions that Luke talked about, because you'll go over them. Practice. Be comfortable. Relax before you try not to schedule an interview when you're running in there at the last minute, because you're always going to be anxious. All of those things are good, but you are there to interview them, like Luke said, just like, they're there to interview you, and take that seriously, because this could be 10, 15, 20 years of your life. It could be. You just don't know.
You never know.
And so anything is possible, but if there is a gut feeling, run it by a good friend. Just say, this is what happened in my interview. And you will be amazed that when I told someone about the interview I just described, they were like, yeah, that probably wasn't a good place. Needless to say, I did not get offered the job. So,
shocking. Shocking to, nor would you have taken it. That is a clear sign of,
it was amazing. Good. And I don't think she realized that she had done it, but everyone else in the room did. And they were trying to pretend it didn't happen.
Oh.
So yes, we are, it may seem like a tangent, but all of this feeds into each other. Interview processes are stressful. They're designed to be that way. You have to turn the tables, and being prepared and being comfortable in your own skin is the most powerful weapon you have to address any of the fear and anxiety you hit with an interview. So I stress that to anybody I speak with. So.
Awesome. Well, let's end it there, because if not, we could literally talk about this for 3 hours.
We could.
I have so many more things I want to share, and I was like, no, this is going to be the longest podcast in the history of the podcast. So we can stop it right there.
Yes.
Well, Indy, thank you so much for coming on this podcast, sharing your wisdom with us. It was wonderful to hear about your perspectives, and of course, everything talking about with the communication and the background. That's fantastic to be able to learn more and to listen from you. For the folks at home who want to be able to follow you, Indy, where can they go to learn more about you and all the good stuff that you're sharing?
Well, they can go to LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn, and I have updates about what I'm doing and the projects that I'm working on there. And that's probably the best place to get in touch with me.
Sounds great. I will put that link in the show notes for folks. But once again, Indy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me. I really have enjoyed it. Thank you so much.